Thank you for joining the JFNA webinar. We will begin in just 2 minutes. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the JFNA webinar. We will begin in just another minute. We are expecting a few more people to join. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Jewish Federations of North America's Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care's webinar. We will be presenting today on person-centered trauma-informed care for family caregivers of older adults with a history of trauma, needs, challenges, and emerging approaches. So we are really glad to welcome the entire Aging Services Network to join this webinar, as well as the JFNA cohort. My name is Leah Bergen, and I'm the project manager at the Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care. Today we're going to cover how to provide person-centered trauma-informed care to family caregivers of older adults with a history of trauma. And during this webinar, you're going to learn the definition of person-centered trauma-informed care. You'll gain a better understanding of the unique needs of family caregivers and older adults who are victims of trauma. Also, you'll learn to develop better understanding as to why it is important and how to provide person-centered trauma-informed care to family caregivers of older adults who are victims of trauma. And finally, you'll hear examples of promising practices and lessons learned in developing programs for family caregivers of older adults who are victims of trauma. For those of you who are part of the JFNA cohort, you will be given a password at the end of this webinar, and you will be required to enter that into the link provided to prove participation in this webinar. So with that, I'd like to get started. First of all, you are all muted currently, and if you have any questions, we encourage you to type questions in the box on the side of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the call. You can type them in live as you think of them, and we will answer them at the end. So first, what is person-centered trauma-informed care? It's a holistic approach to service provision that promotes the dignity and strength and empowerment of trauma victims by incorporating knowledge about the role of trauma victims' lives into agency programs, policies, and procedures. So as our awareness of the prevalence and impact of trauma has increased, so has our awareness of not re-traumatizing clients. There's hardly any research on how trauma affects older adults, so we are trying to fill this niche. For example, with Holocaust survivors, some of the triggers include not wanting to shower because it's reminiscent of gas chambers and experimental facilities. Also, smells like disinfectants and bleach can also be a trigger. Sounds like dogs barking or sirens or boots on wood floors are also triggers. So when training volunteers and when carrying out programming, we try to keep these triggers in mind. So the JFNA Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care, we received funding from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Community Living, Office on Aging, to develop innovative ways to provide person-centered trauma-informed care to Holocaust survivors, with the idea that what we learn from this grant can then be applied to other populations who have also experienced trauma as they age. Through the RFP and a competitive review process, we've awarded 55 grants in less than 3 years. And we provide them with intensive technical assistance, including individual consultations on the development and implementation of evaluation tools for person-centered trauma-informed programming. So to build the national capacity to provide person-centered trauma-informed based services to Holocaust survivors, many of our subgrantees provide training in their communities to hospitals, assisted living facilities, colleges, certified nursing assistants, nursing homes, and many others in the Aging Services Network. We are advancing person-centered trauma-informed care in the broader Aging Services Network by hosting webinars like this, training workshops, presenting in conferences like ASA, having papers published, and we're currently in the process of developing a website. So you may be wondering, what are some examples of how you can infuse person-centered trauma-informed care into your programming? Our subgrantees have come up with really innovative strategies that address physical health needs like low-impact yoga for caregivers or for Holocaust survivors, balance classes. In terms of cognitive health, there's memory classes and drama therapy. For mental health, they provide in-home counseling. Psychoeducational groups have been really successful so that Holocaust survivors can learn more about common trends in depression and anxiety, and they can start recognizing symptoms. Also, there's accessibility in transportation and home modifications, and education and training. As I was saying, our subgrantees are training hospitals and other facilities that provide services to Holocaust survivors. In terms of socialization programs, there have been innovative excursions that are like field trips in their local communities, so they can get to know their environs better and create friendships among people that they're traveling with. We think that promising practices we learn from working with Holocaust survivors can then be applied to other older adult populations who've experienced trauma. So here are a few examples of other older adults who have experienced trauma, and there are many, many more, especially as we're hearing in the news about the Me Too movement and many others. Black Lives Matter. Like most older adults, this population is cared for by unpaid family caregivers who provide shopping and transportation, and also personal care and assistance with bathing and eating. Caregiving is always challenging, and caregiving for older adults who have a history of trauma is particularly challenging. We'll discuss why promising practices to address these challenges are necessary. Family caregiving can be broadly defined as someone who provides unpaid care for a family member, partner, or family, or a friend with a chronic, disabling, or chronic health condition. But there are many other definitions of caregivers. So first, I'd like to take the time to introduce the experts on this call. I'm going to introduce all three at once and then pass it over. First, we have Greg Link, who is our program officer. He's the director of the Office of Supportive and Caregiver Services with the Administration for Community Living and U.S. Administration on Aging, which oversees programs funded under the Older Americans Act. Before coming to AOA, Greg worked at the National Association of State Units on Aging, where he provided technical assistance and training to states on family caregiving. He has a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Central Florida and a master's of arts in government from Johns Hopkins University. Also, we're fortunate to hear on this call Tara Geis, who is a senior program manager for Lutheran Social Services of the Minnesota Caregiver Support and Respite Program. She has a background in she has a master's degree in social work and a minor in gerontology. She has over 30 years of professional experience working with the elderly and their families, and she's practiced social work in Turkey, Germany, North Dakota, and Minnesota. Last but not least, we also have our colleague, Debbie Rosenwein, who is also a social worker. She joined the Older Adult Department at Jewish Family Services in Central New Jersey as a social worker in 2016. She's the director of the Holocaust Department at JFS of Central New Jersey and oversees the JFNA grant in her local community. She has the background of working with the Jewish Federation of Central New Jersey and the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. Her undergraduate work at Indiana University, and she received her MSW from the University of Pennsylvania. So with that, I'd like to pass the microphone over to Greg Link.
Thank you, Leah, and thanks to everyone for tuning into this webinar about a topic that is certainly near and dear to my heart, both for personal as well as professional reasons. For about the past 8 or 9 years, I've been the program director for the National Family Caregiver Support Program, which is part of the Older Americans Act. And in my work, I've come to really understand the importance of and appreciate the need for supporting our family caregivers. Next slide, please. And I don't think that we can ever begin a discussion about what it means to be a family caregiver without first giving some thought to the fact that in some way, shape, or form, the issue of caregiving will touch nearly every one of us somehow during the course of our lives, whether we will be caregivers in the future or are currently doing it, or whether we will need care ourselves one day. I think former First Lady Rosalind Carter sort of summarized the importance of this issue and the breadth that it can take. Next slide. But as we think about what the future holds in terms of our shifting demographics, this slide here, which is taken from the U.S. Census Bureau, shows the aging of our population. And as our population continues to gray and turn older, we're going to see an increasing need for family caregivers to support the needs of our older loved ones as they want to remain independent in their homes and communities for longer periods of time. Next slide, please. Currently, we have some pretty good numbers that talk about the breadth of caregiving nationally. The National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP back in 2015 released their Caregiving in the U.S. study, and it showed that currently, for that prior year, there were approximately 44 million adults, that's about 18.2%, provided care to an older adult or an adult with disabilities in that prior year. And there is true value to this care that is provided. It's been another study estimated that if these caregivers, if we were to try to monetize the care that's provided, it could total approximately $470 billion. And that's considerable if you think about what would happen if these caregivers suddenly disappeared. What would happen to our healthcare system and our long-term services and support system? Historically, the issue of caregiving has been primarily, and it still is, female. However, we are seeing much more attention focused on the needs of male caregivers as more and more men are stepping into the role of care provider, whether it's for their spouse, their parents, siblings, what have you. We also know that caregivers can be older themselves. Nearly 1 in 10 caregivers is 75 years of age or older, and they are providing care for a considerable amount of time. It's not a short-term thing in many cases. 24% provide care for 5 years or longer, and many caregivers are caring for more than one individual. Next slide. So we know that we have some numbers about caregivers. If you could hit the next slide, please. But we know that there are what is defined as the typical caregiver. What the research has shown is that the typical caregiver is a 49-year-old female caring for a 69-year-old female relative who needs help with a long-term physical condition. Next slide. They're providing care on average for about 4 years, doing so about 24.4 hours per week, and they're helping with typically 2 activities of daily living. Those are the self-care tasks. And up to 4 IADLs, those instrumental activities of daily living, such as transportation, bill paying, things of that nature. They're also doing some complex medical and nursing tasks, and oftentimes they have no assistance. Next slide. The typical caregiver also is a high school graduate, but many have some college education as well. They're employed and working full-time. So in addition to their full-time job, they're carrying out their caregiving duties, and they have an average household income of approximately $54,000 nearly 55,000 per year. Not a lot of resources to draw upon when you consider what goes into being a family caregiver. Next slide. The care receivers themselves typically live with the caregiver or close by, and they're hospitalized have been hospitalized once in the past year. Next slide. So family caregiving, I think for anybody who's done it realizes that it's not a simple experience. It's complex. Caregiving can be, if you can hit the next slide, it can cause anxiety, fear, depression. It can be exhausting. There's been some really good work that shows the level of burden many caregivers are experiencing. It can also make a person feel angry or overwhelmed, and it can also be an incredibly isolating experience. I've talked to many caregivers who have said that when they became a caregiver, their own support system of friends kind of disappeared. But caregiving on the positive side can also be an empowering experience. You learn and accomplish a great deal. It can be very much appreciated. It can be satisfying. It can provide reason for hope and personal growth. And it also has been shown to be a true bonding experience between the caregiver and the care recipient. So we look at caregiving as I said, complex, having both good and bad, positive and negative, and hopefully there's some balance in there. Next slide, please. Research has shown that family caregivers need more than just one thing. We know from the research that caregivers need information, and it's not just simple information. It can be information about available services and supports, but it also complex information needs such as legal help, financial, what's available in terms of financial supports, navigating systems for long-term services and supports, nursing home applications, things like that. These caregivers also need assistance, care management, case management in accessing supports and information that are available to them. More and more, we're seeing that what caregivers truly need is education and or counseling to help them better understand or cope with their caregiving responsibilities, whether it's to work through the emotions of being a caregiver or to gain technical knowledge and skills so that they can perform their caregiving roles better. We often hear about respite as the service that caregivers most often request, and indeed some of the survey work that we do here at the Administration for Community Living around our caregiver support programs shows that respite is highly valued as a way to get a break and to relax a little bit, get some time away from the situation so that you can come back and give it your full attention. And finally, we also know that caregivers need other goods and services that are unique to them and to their situation. And so I'm going to be talking in a couple of minutes about the National Family Caregiver Support Program, which is structured around these 5 basic service areas. Next slide. So I know that we're here to talk about working with family caregivers of persons who may have experienced trauma, but I think there's a few important things to remember when we think about working with caregivers in general. And as you work with family caregivers, it's important to remember that, number one, they might not always self-identify as such. They say, I'm the wife, I'm the husband, I'm the son, I'm the daughter, I'm the sibling, I'm the brother, the sister. This is what I do it out of love. So oftentimes the people who are most in the role of a family caregiver don't recognize themselves as such. When you're working with families, it's important to recognize that there may be more than one caregiver in the mix, and they may not all play the same role. You may have the primary caregiver who's doing a lot of the hands-on care, but then you may have another member of the family or the support system that is doing the financial, the legal. Maybe another person provides transportation. So oftentimes it can be a team effort. And one of the things we're going to focus on today is the experience as a caregiver today can be influenced a great deal by what has gone on in the past. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the transfer and second generation trauma, and truly that along with what was the caregiver and the care recipient's relationship like throughout their lives. Oftentimes these dynamics can play a significant role in how the caregiver is reacting to the situation and how we in turn as a support system need to support and touch the family caregivers. Each caregiver's career, and I put that in quotes because it is a career, yes, but their experience as a caregiver has its own trajectory. So, you know, you could have two caregivers each caring for a parent who's had a stroke, a similar situation, similar diagnosis, but because of everything going on, the family dynamics, their life experiences, their own comfort level with doing it, the career that they have as a caregiver can have its own trajectory. A caregiver's needs can change in an instant. And, you know, this can be a new illness or a new condition develops in the care recipient, maybe new external factors such as the caregiver's employment change. We have to be incredibly, and our programs and services have to be incredibly flexible and resilient to meet these oftentimes very quickly changing needs of family caregivers. And when we're talking person-centered, I think it's important to equate that to caregiver-centered. When we're designing person-centered, trauma-informed supports for caregivers, person-centered should equal caregiver-centered. Next slide. So there are a number of programs nationally that can support family caregivers. Many of you are probably familiar with them. Several of them are administered here at the Administration for Community Living. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. I've provided the link for the first four programs here on our website on the slide. But we have the National Family Caregiver Support Program, which was established in 2000 with the reauthorization of the Older Americans Act. It provides funding to every state based on its population age 70 and older to provide services that are centered around information, assistance, education, training and support groups, respite and supplemental services. In 2009, we began implementing the Lifespan Respite Care Program. And these grant programs are now available in 37 states, and they're really helping states and communities work to better coordinate and promote access to quality respite care services and programs across the lifespan, not just for older adults, but and not just through one funding stream, but the many funding streams. Here in AOA, we also fund states and communities to develop services and supports for persons with dementia and their family caregivers. And if you're working with caregivers who may be caring for a veteran, the VA also has a caregiver support program. And it's important to remember that many states and communities also have programs and or discrete services that can also be brought into play to support the family caregiver. Next slide. So my final slide is just some links that I hope everybody is aware of, but that can be useful as you work with family caregivers. The Elder Care Locator, which is funded by the Administration on Aging, you can find services and supports available for both caregivers as well as older individuals through the Elder Care Locator. The National Respite Locator can help you find respite care programs and providers, ADRCs, and then the VA Caregiver Support Program has a comprehensive website about the programs that they offer. So I will stop there and turn it over to our next presenter.
Great, thank you, Greg. I encourage you, if you have questions, to type them in the question box and we'll answer them at the end. Tara?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. We look forward to hearing from your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to share just a little bit more about my background. Early in my career, I worked in Turkey on a military base, and it was right after the Gulf War. And I arrived shortly after families were just being reunited after being separated from their families for almost a year. So what had happened in the beginning of the year, in the middle of the night with only a few hours, spouses and children were evacuated from the base in Turkey, and it was complete chaos. Those who had gas masks were wearing them, and people who were put back on planes to the United States with little or no warning. So I worked with those families after they returned, and of course there was a lot of residual effects for these families. For the past 21 years, I've worked with family caregivers, many who are veterans or caring for veterans, and many who have been diagnosed with PTSD. With that being said, many of us have experienced a traumatic event in our lives. PTSD is often associated with the military, but it impacts many more than just the military community. So the definition of trauma results from exposure to an incident or a series of events that is emotionally disturbing or life-threatening. Next slide, please. So 70% of adults in the United States have experienced a traumatic event at least once in their life. Not everybody who experiences a traumatic event has PTSD. 20% of these people go on to develop PTSD, and women are more likely to develop PTSD than men. And these statistics I did get from the National Institute of Mental Health. So next slide, please. So what about post-traumatic stress disorder in older adults? How can that differ? With our older adults, we see that there's potential that they may deny mental or emotional issues or symptoms. It's often a huge stigma in their generation to have mental health issues. They'll often report physical symptoms and not disclose any other symptoms that may be occurring. And they'll often deny or minimize reported trauma or symptoms. Things like we hear, it wasn't that bad. And next slide, please. And again, many older adults view, oops, can we go back? Okay, so many older adults view having mental health issues as weakness. Many blame themselves for the trauma they experienced, and we do see this across the board too. I shouldn't have taken that walk by myself. This was my fault, etc. Older adults may have more negative disclosure experiences earlier in life. So, you know, not only do they blame themselves, but sometimes other people blame them for as well, or they say things that aren't very helpful. Oh, it wasn't that bad, or you know, you're a pretty weak person and you really can't handle this. So things like that. This is really a common occurrence in the military, and actually still is, where the person is experiencing mental health issues associated with the trauma. They're often ostracized by fellow soldiers and their leaders as well. Okay, next slide, please. So we are seeing many more Vietnam veterans who are caregivers or care receivers coming in for assistance with PTSD. They're now at retirement age and having a lot of time to reflect, and now are struggling. Memory loss, such as Alzheimer's disease, can bring that person back to the place and time, and they are experiencing trauma and PTSD symptoms as a result. Things like having more frequent flashbacks are pretty common. Next slide, please. Media coverage of war and tragedy can lead to flashbacks. And, you know, when we have caregivers who are taking care of care receivers, it can be as simple as, you know, monitoring what is on the TV, because that can bring back a lot of unpleasant memories. Unhealthy methods as coping, such as drug and alcohol use, may catch up with the older adult or be abandoned without being replaced by healthy coping methods. And what I mean by that, so if you have someone who does not have access to drugs and alcohol, and they've used those across their life in order to cope with trauma, and then all of a sudden that's taken away and nothing healthy is replaced, you know, they're really going to start struggling with the trauma they experience and the PTSD symptoms. So next slide, please. And I did want to mention too, because many people with memory loss or dementia related illnesses, they experience a lot of changes in their personality. Doctors are not always recognizing PTSD symptoms. Also, depression is hugely underdiagnosed. Instead, they often associate the unusual behaviors with the dementia that the person is experiencing. Therefore, PTSD and depression often go untreated. Memories of the traumatic experience may become stronger in older adults. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of reading on recently is that research shows that family caregivers can experience PTSD because of their caregiving experience. It can be very traumatic for that person, especially if they are not getting the support that they need oftentimes. And if you work with caregivers, I'm sure that you have witnessed this as well. You're seeing a lot of people who are primarily doing it by themselves 24/7, day after day. And it can be very difficult things like seeing their parent or their spouse change before their eyes. They're no longer the same person that they are. Maybe they have some really challenging behaviors that are going on that they're trying to cope with. And so it is very, very important early on for caregivers to get these supports in place and to get the help that they're needing to try to minimize some of the traumatic experience, because it is. I mean, I think I've been working with family caregivers, like I said, the last 21 years. I think it's one of the most difficult jobs that there is, and I really commend people who are doing it because it is not easy and they sacrifice an awful lot. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so tips to provide that we provide family caregivers. And a lot of these things, I want to say, they're very simplistic things and kind of things, you know, that we all know. Oftentimes people, you know, when I'm working with families or I'm working with other professionals, you know, they're hoping for some great one-fits-all strategy that is going to work a miracle for families, but really it's very simplistic things, and to, you know, to really focus on person-centered care. I love the term that we heard earlier was caregiver-centered care, because it's so true. So, you know, the person, whether they're experiencing PTSD or their loved one is experiencing PTSD, to be really educated on what that means, you know, to get that education. And not only that, you know, to get education and training on caregiving itself. The more you know about the disease, the more you know about caregiver burden and things like that, the better off that you'll be. One of the things that we do in our program is we have a national educational program, and some of you may be familiar with it. It is called Powerful Tools for Caregivers, and this is an evidence-based program. People can be trained to teach this course. It's a 6-week course, hour and a half at a time, and it focuses on things like, you know, how do you deal with the difficult emotions such as grief, anger, frustration? How do you ask for the help that you need? How do you find resources? Things like that, very practical things. And it's been so successful in the programming that we do. Caregivers not only take this course once, they come back and take it a second time because they get things out of it, you know, every single time. We tell caregivers, pace yourself, take those breaks that you need. Otherwise, you know, we see caregivers who are not taking care of themselves begin to burn out. Statistics will show that caregivers often become sicker than the person that they're caring for. They end up in the nursing home or they pass away before their person that they care for. When I first started in this position, I read that statistic, and being naive at the time, I thought it was a misprint. Because how could the person who's already ill get sicker than the person that's taking care of them? But, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but stress does horrible things to people's health. Learn positive coping skills. We work with families a lot on things that they can do to take care of themselves. Sometimes caregivers, they get a little bit exasperated with us saying, you need to take care of yourself. We sound like a broken record, and where do they find the time to do that? It can be very simplistic things. Getting up half an hour early in the morning, sitting out on the deck, listening to the birds, having a cup of tea. The things don't have to be expensive, they don't have to take long, but they do need to incorporate them into their schedule sometime. Attend a caregiver support group. With that being said, are, you know, people who attend also a PTSD group, if that is also something you're experiencing, because there is such healing power in being with others who have walked in similar shoes and are experiencing similar things. respite care. I cannot preach respite care enough. You need to take a break. People who are doing the caregiving need to take a break, even a couple of hours a week where you don't have to worry about the person that you're caring for is going to make a huge difference. Take care of your health. Seek professional help when you're needed, both for yourself and for your loved one. And again, this is oftentimes difficult for our older caregivers because they seeking especially mental health professional help for mental health is a weakness. In fact, one of the things that we have done with our caregiver support groups, we no longer call them caregiver support groups, we call them discussion groups. It has nothing to do, they can associate it with mental health. I mean, they're all for coming for a cup of coffee and a cookie and talking with others. And we've seen our attendance rise because of that. Maintain social activities, very, very important. What we see is when people's loved ones who have passed away and they did not maintain those social activities, it can be a very, very isolating experience. Their social contacts may have been the home health agency coming in, the respite providers, all of that, the support groups, and once all that's gone, they can be very isolated, and that in itself can be very traumatizing. So we encourage people to maintain those ties in the community, and again, by utilizing respite so they can do that. Exercising, living one day at a time, keeping your sense of humor is huge. Again, self-care, maintaining those important relationships in your life, living one day at a time, and letting others help. And we tend to see people who are very stoic and independent and almost feel like they're failing if they do let others help. So next slide, please. Okay. And again, I really want to focus on person-centered care. I love the term caregiver-centered care, and with some permission, I would like to start using that term. Again, it's so important to develop individual care plans for your families and involve the family and the older adult if possible and if it makes sense in that care plan. Very, very important to know the older person's history, and flexibility is key. Important to have a plan B, especially when you're dealing with memory loss. What works one day may not work the next. So I really admire families and also providers, because it is a lot of brainstorming and trying to figure out what works for that person, and what works one day, again, may not work the next. So always important to have a plan B and maybe a plan C as well. So next slide, please. So some of the innovative strategies that we use both for our caregivers and our care receivers, again, they're very simplistic things, but they work. So we incorporate these types of things in our programs. Pet therapy. At our group respite programs, we have volunteer dogs that come in. We do art therapy with our caregivers and our care receivers. We do physical activity. There's something to say about endorphins. You know, you've probably read the studies that endorphins are more powerful than morphine. And so no matter how physically incapacitated the person is, there can be exercise routines adapted to what they can do. We do both field trips for our caregivers and care receivers. And these are just fantastic. It takes them away from the world of caregiving. So it may be, we have a group we call our dinner group. Once a month, our caregivers get together and they pick a different restaurant and they go and they just have fun. We have, sometimes in our groups, we will have speakers come and talk. We have music, we have crafts, all kinds of things for them to do. And two, these things are so important because many times what we find with older adults is that they were so busy in their life, working, taking care of kids, doing all of those things that a lot of them have not developed a lot of hobbies. They don't even know what they like to do or what they're good at. And sometimes at 60 and 70 years old, they will find that they have these hidden talents where they're artists and they have an amazing talent to do that. Gardening, just getting your hands in the dirt and creating beautiful things, and gardening around their house. I mean, gardening incorporates every sense, smelling and feeling and seeing, and just watching something grow day to day is great. Baking, some people love to bake. And again, person-centered care, because if someone made me bake, it would cause me stress. It never looks like the picture. I don't like it, and it never tastes good, so that wouldn't be one for me. Volunteering, I cannot stress how volunteering can be so healing, both for the caregiver and care receiver. It has an amazing impact on taking a person outside of their self and focusing on something else. To give you an example, we have a lady who has Alzheimer's disease. Her son takes care of her. She's at home, really feeling depressed. Her husband has died, and she feels like she has no purpose in life, and she really is expressing wanting to die. This is someone who was out in her community volunteering every single day. And her depression was very, very hard on her son who was caring for her. We have a volunteer going and taking her out. Now she works at a homeless shelter, serving meals, helping to cook, helping to chop. It's changed everything for this family. They're doing very, very well. It's lifted depression for both of them. And then talking to others who have experienced trauma, talk therapy, talking to others who've walked in similar shoes, telling your story over and over and over is very healing and has a way of desensitizing that story and making that a little bit better. Okay, next slide, please. Very quickly, I know I'm running a little short on time, and I want to be respectful of the next speaker, but I have asked permission and gotten release of information. I want to talk a little bit about some of the families that we've worked with. This is Stanley and our volunteer, Crystal, who's the puppy in the picture. Stanley is a Korean vet who has experienced post-traumatic stress because of his war experience. He also, as a young child, witnessed his mother die in a very tragic accident. Stanley now has Alzheimer's disease and experiences the symptoms with post-traumatic stress are very strong now, and he experiences frequent flashbacks, both from the Korean War and of his mother's death. And so with that, his wife has really, really struggled as a caregiver on how to deal with this. So we've given her some very innovative strategies. So she is receiving counseling from us. She attends a support group. Stanley attends a support group for post-traumatic stress for people who have memory loss, which was very innovative. Some of these groups are very, very new. He goes to our group respite program, and this is him at our group respite program. Sometimes he will just start crying and nothing can calm him. This dog is amazing. It senses when he's struggling, it jumps on his lap. Stanley pets the dog for maybe 5 minutes and he's okay again. Next slide, please. This is Paul. And Paul takes care of his dad, Jack. Both are veterans. Jack is a Korean War vet. Paul is Jack is a Korean War vet, and Paul is a Vietnam veteran. Both have struggled with PTSD. Paul takes care of his dad, who has Parkinson's disease. They both utilize support groups, in-home respite care, and they both volunteer together at a local homeless shelter, helping in the gardens in the summer. Next slide. This is John. John is a Vietnam vet, and his caregiver is his wife, Bonnie. John's helicopter was shot down, and he fell 50 feet and landed on his head. He has struggled with cognition problems ever since. He's had a traumatic brain injury, and it's getting worse as he gets older. His devoted wife has taken care of him all of these years with very little help. After being referred to our program, John attends our group respite program. They get in-home respite care as well. And you can see his volunteer Carrie in the picture. Bonnie also has ongoing counseling and attends support group as well. And next slide, please. Finally, Paula. Paula takes care of her mom, Madeline. Paula was violently attacked as a teenager and as a result really struggles with PTSD. The stress of caring for her mom has made those symptoms much worse. Paula is now utilizing respite care counseling, attends a yoga and meditation class, and attends educational sessions on caregiving at our organization. And because of the supports that we have in place, she is coping much better. So, okay, that is my presentation, and I thank everybody for listening today and for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tara. We appreciate your wisdom. Next, I'd like to introduce Debbie.
Thank you, Leah. It's nice to be part of the group. I want to just give you, next slide, please, a quick overview of my presentation. I'll just talk quickly about unique needs and challenges of family caregivers, a little bit about transmission of trauma, the impact of older adults' trauma experience on their ability to receive care, providing PCTI care to family caregivers, and sharing some promising practices, strategies, lessons learned, and applications to other groups. Next slide, please. To put the material into a proper framework, I just want to review some emotions that survivors experience as a result of the Holocaust. For instance, you have this death imprint where survivors witness the brutality of death, and these images are etched in their mind. There's cognitive expectations where you have nightmares of persecution, and particularly as they're aging and become more sedentary, as Tara mentioned, you know, there's more time and these become a little more pervasive. There's also the survivor's guilt. Why am I still alive when my family has perished? The search for meaning. Why did these atrocities happen, and seeking a rationale? And then there's a whole numbness, the inability to express emotions. And it's often used as a defense mechanism to avoid overwhelmingly painful memories, but it does create a withdrawal between the victim and the other human contact. Next slide, please. We have to understand, too, that older people did not survive the Holocaust. So in some respects, we're in uncharted territory. Few support networks existed, and with the whole immigrant experience, you have a culture and language barrier. And after the Holocaust, when survivors married and started families, next slide, please, they were so anxious to rebuild that oftentimes they entered into loveless marriages. And survivors, you know, if we want to talk now a little bit about how trauma is transmitted, in these marriages, survivors often remained in marriages despite a lack of emotional intimacy. So when you have a parent who's detached, whether it's emotional numbness due to what they experienced during the Holocaust or unhappiness in the marriage, there's an inability to be attuned to the developmental needs of the child. And trauma also interferes with parental competency. These emotions become transmitted to the child. Kids are very astute. Another way that trauma can be transmitted is through, you know, just compulsive retelling of a survivor's story or absolute silence and wanting to withhold information. Next slide, please. So if we look at some of the challenges of caregivers who inherit this trauma, we see that children have an inner struggle. They want to maintain ties with their parents' past. They're driven to, you know, remember or put themselves in their parents' shoes, what it was like for their parents in the camps and, you know, while they were hiding. But yet at the same time, they want to live their own lives. They want to separate from the trauma. It's kind of like a tug of war. Children are also striving to protect their parents. Their parents have been through so much. They've experienced an inordinate amount of loss in many cases, and the children want to protect their parents. So oftentimes they guard their parents against anything that's happening socially or emotionally or academically. And that's not typical, of growing up and kids. So it puts a huge burden on the child. Children are also expected to be super achievers. They should excel in school. They should excel professionally. They're often carrying the burden of being a replacement for lost family. And then as survivors age, you have a role reversal where the children are becoming the caregivers. And the children often have feelings of anger and resentment toward the parents since they were not able to have a childhood of their own. And then two, you have guilt because the children have guilt because of what the parents have experienced, and they have an obligation, they feel an obligation to care for their parents until the end, and they are often overwhelmed and reluctant to ask for help. Next slide, please. So while we speak about how trauma can be transmitted, I think it's very important to also realize that resilience, like trauma, can be transmitted across the generations. And we often see that Holocaust survivors and children have a tendency to be very task-oriented, hard workers, actively cope, adapt to challenges, and have strong family values. You can turn the next slide, please. So let's examine how older adult trauma can affect care. So early life trauma can complicate common caregiver tasks and really amplify the stress. For example, things that we would think are just very basic, like taking a shower or standing in line if or using a public restroom. These activities can trigger, and I know Leah spoke about some of this, memories of past trauma. You have, the shower, memories of the gas chamber. This can result in anxiety, fear, and refusal of care. So that becomes very difficult. You also have physicians and invasive medical procedures as survivors age, whether they might need anesthesia or an IV injection. This becomes reminiscent of injections given for death during the Holocaust. And doctors were often in a position of authority regarding who would live and who would die and executing these arrangements as well. Then you have hospitals. If survivors need to go to hospitals or be relocated to skilled nursing facilities, there's a lack of control, a lack of privacy, a vulnerability, a powerlessness, and an inability to be really a part of a decision-making process. It becomes very uncomfortable for the survivor. And then you have fear of the aging process and death, which are, typical concerns, but when they're superimposed by the remembrance of the dehumanized deaths from the Holocaust, it becomes a totally different picture. So next slide, please. When we take this into account, it is very important to have a PCTI framework when we are working as professionals with caregivers. And it's important that we be sensitive, and I know we've discussed this. We want to be sensitive to their culture, their experience, and really work collaboratively with caregivers and survivors if possible to develop a care plan. We want to listen to what they have to say. We don't want to just come in and dictate. It should be an open discussion. It's equally important to address the needs of staff so that their knowledge and interaction with the survivors can be at its best. And I'll just give you a prelude to our best practice and let you know that we do some staff training. We train our clinical staff, our support staff, and our home health aides, and all around PCTI. In my next slides, I want to focus in more detail on some of our promising practices that we've done for caregivers. And I need I want to acknowledge the support that I received from our Holocaust team, Alyssa Reiner and Greg Yucht, who are our social workers, and Kathleen McMahon, who is our nurse. Next slide, please. So we support the needs of caregivers through programs and other supportive resources. In chronological order, since the inception of our JF&A grant, we began with home visits. It was a collaborative visit between our Russian-speaking social worker, Greg, and our nurse, Kathleen, where we identified survivors from the former Soviet Union, and we spoke to the survivor and the caregiver. And we found that the caregiver's concerns primarily focused on stress, finances, and sleep. And to Greg's point, these interviews also helped the caregiver to self-identify, because oftentimes we found that the caregiver did not see themselves in the role of a caregiver. Next slide, please. We've also had 2 caregiver conferences, because as we've discussed, caregiving can be very isolating, and these conferences have given us a chance to become more educated and to have a network and connect with others. Our first conference was entitled Meeting the Challenges of Family Caregiving with Dr. Irit Felsen. In the fall, we did a conference with Drs. Barry Jacobs and Julia Meyer on finding meaning in family caregiving. And this coming Sunday, you're still welcome to join us. We have a presenter, Jennifer Rutberg, who's going to talk about caring for a loved one while being mindful of your own needs. How do you carry out that balancing act? In our first 2 conferences, we had breakout sessions where they could go to groups about Alzheimer's or brain health, caring for Holocaust survivors, mindfulness, meditation, and physical aspects of self-care, which included sleep, nutrition, and exercise. Next slide, please. The foundation for all of our work has really been guided largely by the foundation of our Caregiver Advisory Board. Our Caregiver Advisory Board is made up of caregivers of our survivors, community members, and professionals. We convene monthly or every other month, and we review activities of our department, and we really ask for their input. And it's become a very wonderful exchange. They've given us ideas, program ideas for our new grant, and we've also, for our workshop, we've gotten some ideas. So, and we also work on establishing leadership through our advisory committee. The next slide, I want to, give an example of some of their ideas, our Caregiver Advisory Board. We were convening caregiver support groups in the beginning, and we learned early on that this was not the right direction for our constituency, and we transitioned to these groups into psychoeducational workshops that focus on self-care, because our caregivers said that they want to just have a respite from, their work. And so topics that they're interested in are mindfulness and meditation, yoga, painting, cooking, stress reduction through guided imagery and self-hypnosis, sleep, cooking. And what we do is we have this in the evening. It's one evening a month. We have dinner, and then we have a guest presenter. Next slide, please. So from our work, we have seen that what we're doing can be applied to other populations experiencing trauma. For instance, assistance with transition programs, whether it's for new immigrants or prisoners. We just had an academic speak to us in a staff training about the importance of enabling people to feel secure when they come into a new environment. So I think, we can equate some similarity to the work that Hayes did, in the late 40s with Holocaust survivors coming to America, and even the work that JFS has done with Soviet Jews in the 80s. Also, I think interviews are very important. It's firsthand information. It's personalizing situation, and it's showing intense interest. Socialization programs are also significant. It gives the caregivers a chance to develop networks. And self-care techniques we're learning are also very much wanted, whether it's yoga or cooking, meditation. And it's very important, most of all, to have an infrastructure in place so that a seamless transition of services can be offered. Next slide, please. And we've learned that trauma can be applied to other groups who might, for example, be experiencing retirement and inactivity, you know, when there's more time to generate thoughts from the past, whether it's people, you know, Syrian refugees. We have the whole Immigration Dreamers group, Black Lives Matter, which we've mentioned, sexual violence. And in terms of resources, next slide, please. We do, you can advance to the next slide, please. We do a monthly self-care newsletter. We also have done a first responders brochure that has gone to police departments, first aid squads in our area. We also have written articles on caregiving for local Jewish papers. I have contact information for our speakers. We have a website, and you know, have more in-depth information from our one-on-one home visits to, you know, with the caregivers that were done collaboratively with our nurse and Russian-speaking social worker. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Actually, thank you to all the speakers. I've learned a lot through this presentation. I encourage you to type your questions in the question box. And before we hang up, we will show the password to the JFNA subgrantees. Also, this webinar will be recorded and you will receive the PowerPoints tomorrow. Michael, do you have any questions?
Yes. Our first question is, in working with people experiencing post-traumatic stress, the recommendation is often to help the individual return to the here and now from the there and then. This is especially complicated with people who have dementia who are also Holocaust survivors. With dementia, it is often counterproductive to try and reorient to time and place. For a Holocaust survivor who is disoriented and back in that experience, this raises a real challenge. Have any of the panelists had any experience with this dilemma?
Tara or Debbie, do either of you have an answer to this question?
Could Michael just repeat that? I'm sorry.
The question? Yeah. So in working with people experiencing post-traumatic stress, the recommendation is often to help the individual return to the here and now from the, quote, there and then. This is especially complicated with people who have dementia who are also Holocaust survivors. With dementia, it's often counterproductive to try and reorient to time and place. For a survivor who is disoriented and is reliving this experience, this raises a real challenge. Have the panelists had any experience with this dilemma?
This is Tara. For us, in working with people with memory loss, we, like I said in my presentation, we try to find what soothes that person. And again, with memory loss, it does definitely hold challenges, you know, and so, and again, it comes down to person-centered care, finding out where that person is at in their memory loss, what they are able to understand, what soothes them, and to figure out what is best in their personal situation to help them. So I'm not sure, hopefully that's answered what they were asking.
And I'll just, this is Debbie, you know, mention, yes, that is very challenging, no question, and I would support everything that Tara said. one thing that we offer for survivors is a monthly socialization program. And I find that, you know, they just come and they have a meal and some entertainment. And so we're not expecting them to, you know, speak with us, and they see other people. Oftentimes they meet up with family members, and so whatever they can gain from the experience, we want to let them take what, you know, at whatever level they can gain, we feel is important. So you know, that's an example of an activity that we offer.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, I'm also interested in your experience with secondary traumatic stress in the children and other family members of Holocaust survivors.
Okay, yes. Right, secondary traumatic stress is very important with working with Holocaust survivors and their children. And I think, you know, I tried to highlight a few things that the children are working with, but we try to engage some of the children on our caregiver advisory board because they, you know, are caregivers in some capacity. You know, they might be working, but they might be overseeing the care that's taking place. So we do try to involve them, and we try to be very sensitive, you know, to their needs and their experience and the experience of their parent. And I think this is also where person-centered care becomes, you know, very important, very individualized. And, you know, you can't have a cookie cutter approach, but we do try to be extremely sensitive in working with this group.
Thank you, Debbie. We got a question about professional caregivers, and I wanted to build on what you had said, that secondary trauma is very real, and it is a concern. This webinar is really focusing on family caregivers and non-paid caregivers as well. So if you are interested in having a future webinar about professional caregivers, for professional caregivers, feel free to drop me a line. My information is on the screen.
Great. And our next question is, if they are called, quote, discussion groups, how do you get it out to the community about who it is intended to reach? We've had a challenge with calling it a caregiver group, in part because they don't see themselves as a caregiver, and also because of a possible stigma.
This is a common challenge related to outreach and how to get caregivers to attend events. Debbie, would you like to speak to this?
Sure. So I will tell you that in the beginning, what we're having these support groups, you know, and the idea is that it would be, you know, they would share and open up and talk. And when we realized that that's not what people wanted and it wasn't going to work with our community, here's an example. We just did this in December, and at the top it says, this is our publicity, yoga and meditation. It does say actually techniques for caregivers, but we put what the program is, and then we put, we have a picture of somebody in a yoga position, and it's bright colors, and it's catchy. And, you know, we just did one on cooking. We had a cooking demonstration. She cooks and blogs about her recipes. And we put in the top of that, simply delicious, healthy family meals with a twist. And we put the presenter, and we don't even mention the word caregiver there. And then, you know, we have a little paragraph at the bottom that explains, you know, who's funding this and so forth. But it goes, you know, and it goes to our caregivers. So we're stressing the activity more than we are stressing, you know, for the caregivers. But I mean, we send it to, you know, we have a group of, we have a database that it goes to, and people are required to call and make reservations. So if, you know, somebody is not appropriate, it, you know, it is screened. But we promote the program.
Great, thank you, Debbie.
Our next question is, for the panelists. Can you please share 2 to 3 tips on how you lead a support group for people with dementia and PTSD? Or I guess and.
So if this is for caregivers, I think this question is more geared towards people who've experienced trauma, and we're really trying to keep it focused on how to best serve caregivers. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next question.
So we had one person ask, where is the caregiver conference that was mentioned that's coming on Sunday, and is there a website to access that? You can reach out to Leah, and she will be happy to send that information along to you.
It will be in Central New Jersey.
Yeah, it will be in Central New Jersey at Jewish Family Service, 655 Westfield Avenue. And if you're interested, I'm happy to speak with you offline.
Great, thank you. I have a question from somebody that says, how many people attend your caregiver groups, and are they caregivers of Holocaust survivors only?
I can talk about that for a minute. We have about generally 15 to 20 people attend. They are predominantly caregivers of survivors. We sometimes get a few who are, you know, caregivers of non-survivors, but we do primarily promote that event to our Holocaust caregivers. It was interesting, about a month ago, you know, we hold these programs at 6:30 in the evening, and the weather was going to change and become kind of dicey at night, and we were very concerned about our attendance. And it shows people really want some distraction from caregiving, because we had a nice group. It was a good attendance, so that was a good lesson for us. It was encouraging.
Thank you.
Great. Our next question is, have any of your partners released any practices or approaches they feel are most applicable to larger aging services fields beyond survivors? If not, will this be coming? And the answer is, we are in the process of that. We plan to launch a website that will house all of the promising practices of this grant. And while they have been used with survivors, we believe that they can be adapted to the whole broader aging services network. So we will be posting that hopefully in the near future. I'm looking for our next question. What do you suggest having in place for staff who are also exposed to secondary trauma?
Actually, I think we're gonna, if you want to send me an email and suggest an idea for a future webinar about professional caregivers, we're happy to take this as a suggestion, and we can have another webinar focused on that for sure.
So that is all of our questions currently. We are going to go to the next slide, which has the code for our cohort.
So first of all, I want to thank all of you for joining the webinar. We really appreciate your time, and we welcome your suggestions. You will soon receive an evaluation to complete about this webinar. We are always looking for ways to improve and suggestions for future webinars. And I'm hearing loud and clear that one for how to support professional caregivers is needed. And so we will take that into consideration. There are ways to stay plugged in with us. We plan to invite you to our future training webinars. We will let you know when we launch our website. We have webinars like this on a fairly regular basis, which you are more than welcome to join. And we also share resources periodically and can update you with them. We will record this webinar and send the PowerPoint tomorrow. And just to make sure, if you need my email address for any questions, it's Leah, L-E-A-H .Bergen, B-E-R-G-E-N @jewishfederations.org, or you can send something to the Holocaust Center @jewishfederations.org. Also, if you're part of our JFNA webinar, if you're part of our JFNA cohort, this is the passcode. Please write it down, and we will send out a link for you to approve, to verify your participation. Thank you very much for participating. Is there a reason